a series that we started out in Lent, beginning of Lent. Boy, did it go fast. And today, the series was doing things that we would not give up. You know how in Lent you always talk about things you're going to give up, and so we decided to do things that we would not give up. And so today, we're talking about humility. And that reminds me of a story I read the other day. There were three boys who were outside the school, and they were talking about how successful each one of their dads were. And the first boy said, well, you know, my dad scribbled something on a piece of paper, calls it a poem, and they give him $100. Well, the second boy thought for a second. He said, well, you know, my dad scribbled something on a piece of paper. They call it a song, and they give him $1,000. The third boy waited for a little bit, and he says, you know, my dad scribbles something on a piece of paper. He calls it a sermon, and it takes 4 men with plates to gather up all the money. You know, there are 21 references to humility and 31 references to meekness in the Scriptures. And you're probably wondering, like I did, well, is there any difference? And the answer is no, there's not. In fact, the words are interchangeable. They're synonyms for each other. When you talk about meekness, it's defined as humility. When you talk about humility, it's defined as meekness. And what's even more interesting about that, there's only a few words that are the same thing in the original language of Hebrew and the original language of Greek that translate the same way back and forth across the Testaments. And meekness and humility are one of those power words. But when you think about it, neither one of those is really something that we envy a lot or talk about or define other people as. And most of the time we talk about people as being hardworking or successful or smart or creative. But when's the last time you heard somebody say, wow, he's so humble? Or she is just, she's so meek. And we just don't hear that. And that's kind of because we sort of box the word humble and meek into one corner, and we call it weak. But if you look in the Scriptures, how different? Because in Scripture, some of the very strongest characters in all of Scripture are defined in terms of humility and meekness. You turn to Numbers, there's a description of a guy named Moses there. Now, Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone on the face of the earth. God goes on to define his relationships with human beings and then his very unique and special relationship that he enjoyed with Moses based on that very thing of humility and meekness. First of all, he talks about prophets and seers and that he speaks to them in dreams and in visions. And then he talks about Moses. But this is not true of my servant Moses, God says. He is faithful in all my house, meaning all of his family, spiritual family. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. It's those very distinct characteristics of humility and meekness that enabled Moses to enjoy this very special relationship with God. I believe that God is drawn to humility like steel is drawn to a magnet. Humility does two things. It starts and it fosters the divine human relationship. The prophet Micah wanted us to understand that this relationship with God doesn't necessarily have to be a complicated one, full of rules and regulations. In fact, Micah said this about a relationship with God. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. There are probably lots of reasons why whole nations and cultures fall out of relationship with God. We could probably name them as moral failure or ethical failure or spiritual failure. But that's really just the kind of fruit. The taproot of why nations and people and individuals fall out of relationship with God is really because of one taproot. Pride.
What?
Maintaining our self-reliance and our self-independence at all costs. And that's why God advised Israel, and Solomon in particular, on the day that the temple that Solomon had built for God, how, if the nation decides to turn away and fall away and to break covenant from God, how that could be restored once again to vitality. And in one of the most quoted pieces of Scripture in either Testament, God advises Moses and Israel this: "If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven. I will forgive their sins and I will heal their land." Humility starts and it continues to nurture our relationship with God. And in the meekness of humility, we find out that the broken relationship that we may have encountered with God can be restored, renewed, and reunited through humility. If you think about it, every major revival in human history, every significant move of God towards humanity, in fact, even the simplest little prayer hinges on our personal practice and lifestyle of humility. In humility and meekness, it becomes clear to us that the biggest obstacle between us and God is us. In humility, we gain the power to ask for forgiveness. In humility, we get the conviction to ask forgiveness for our wrongdoing. In humility, we begin to comprehend the shoulders on which we stand of every single generation that preceded us here to this place today. Generational disrespect is something that's been going on for a very long time. I think suspicion abounds on both ends of that formula. Older generations think that younger generations are trying to take over. And younger generations are sure they've got a better idea about everything. Truth is, both generations lack the humility to have a sense of appreciation of what both ends of the formula bring to the table. If that's true now, I must understand it was also true in Peter's day. Peter writes to a very persecuted community somewhere in Asia Minor. Young people, in the same way, be submissive to those who are older. But he's not singling out young people, because in the very next sentence he writes this: "All of you clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble." And I bet until you heard that, you probably didn't connect the fact that it's humility that becomes the pipeline of God's grace to us individually. It's the conduit that transports His unmerited favor on each of us. And I bet you also never suspected that it was God Himself who was opposing our breakthroughs, our promotions, and our advancements, because of our prideful self-reliance and our fierce independence. I can do this. I will finish this. I will tough this out. You know, it took a while for Peter to figure out that he might need God more than he needed his own self. I mean, when Jesus brought up the subject that, he was going to be handed over into the hands of sinners, that he would be betrayed and denied, Peter swore he would do neither. "I will never leave you and I will never deny you." He was sure about that. And yet, in the matter of just a few hours, sometime between 4 o'clock and sunrise, Peter didn't just deny his master once or twice, but 3 times. We heard the passage at the very end of the cantata. The women come to anoint the body of Jesus, and they meet an angel who tells them, he's not here. He's risen. But go and tell Peter and the disciples. Perhaps the most prideful assumption we make is that we have fallen so far. We have forgotten God so long, and we have lived without consideration of anyone else but ourselves, to the point that we figure God doesn't care about us anymore. You know, that might be the most dangerous element of pride, to assume that we are beyond the reach of grace. And that's why Peter, who knew from personal experience, by alienating himself from the other disciples, that when we humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, He will lift us up in due time. And we can cast all of our anxiety and fears and worries that we aren't good enough on Him, because He cares for us. The strength of our meekness is best seen when each of us can humbly admit we need to be under the mighty hand of God, not above it. Meekness and humility is something that none of us can afford to give up, Lent or any time of the year, no matter what age we are. Let us stand to sing our last song. Our 302, Christ the Lord is risen today.
Lead today in big